Hi, thanks so much for coming, and I am so pleased to be invited to this august institution. Thank you for spending your Saturday night learning about science. So we're going to talk today about the history of games and the ways that they secretly power our modern world. So the idea for this book came to me during COVID lockdown, when, like a lot of people, I turned to games to pass the time. And I was reminded of just how captivating they are. At the same time, I was working at DeepMind, which is the company known for creating AI programs that best human masters at complex games like Go and StarCraft. So it set me to wondering, what makes games so fascinating to people to the point where companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars training programs to play games? And more than that, what can we learn about people by studying what fascinates them? And for thousands of years, people have been fascinated by games. Games and play have a deep role in human history. And while games are often dismissed as trivial, the more I looked into it, the more I realized they kind of set up the fabric of how we see the world and move in it without us necessarily knowing. So I hope to convince you tonight that it's time we take games more seriously. Not just as an art form, but as a science. So when I started this book, I was not aware of just how dominant games are in the current culture. So to demonstrate this is just a simple pie chart of the markets for different forms of entertainment. And you can see games and gambling are about as big as all other major forms of entertainment combined: TV, music, movies, and books. So they are hugely popular. There's estimated 3 billion gamers worldwide, and that could include very casual people who play on their mobile phones, and that can include people who play games for a living. And for those who are not aware, there's also these things called esports events, which are kind of like major sports events, except it will be players playing competitive video games instead of sports. And these can draw in hundreds of millions of viewers. So games are a really big force in the world today. And this is not just true of modern times. Games have been with us for thousands of years. So this is an image of potentially one of the oldest game boards in the archaeological record. There's a number of game boards like this that looked like something like a game like Mancala, which is a counting game that we still play today. And if these are indeed game boards, these are somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years old, making them much older than written language. And these are found all over Africa and the Middle East. And this one in particular was found in Kenya in a group of about 20 of them, making this potentially something like an ancient arcade. So it's not just humans that play, all kinds of animals play. Most mammals play. There's evidence that birds and reptiles and potentially even insects play. This is a bee playing with some balls it's given. So it's a really deep evolutionary behavior. And just to quickly define, play is a kind of behavior undertaken for pleasure alone, whereas games are a little more formal. It's mostly humans play games. It's sort of like there's like a system with a goal, and the humans are working to achieve that goal with rules restricting how they get to it. More intelligent animals tend to play more. So this is a very simple proxy for this. The brain size of different mammalian orders compared to how playful they are, the animals with bigger brains, the more intelligent animals tend to play more. And of course, humans play a lot, and so do apes. And play is one of these behaviors that's really hard for neuroscientists to study because it's just so hard to abolish. You can't really study something unless you can have two groups of like animals that play and animals that don't play. So years ago, scientists took the entire cortex off a rat's brain, and this is the part of the brain thought to be responsible for like higher intelligence. And those rats still played, even when you did it when they were like very young. So I'll tell you about one way that scientists got around this. So it turns out that rats laugh. And we diverged from rats 75 million years ago, but we all still laugh. And this is a video of human experimenter tickling a rat, and it's making these ultrasonic vocalizations, which is basically laughter. And I should also say, I find this delightful, that other animals also laugh, including apes, and other animals will also tell jokes. So Coco, the gorilla, who was taught sign language, once asked her keeper for more juice, and she was denied the juice. She took a straw, held it up to her nose, and signed for sad elephant. So animals have a good time. And also, to prove that this rat likes being tickled, the authors of this paper show a video of the rat doing a behavior called Freudensprünge, or joy jumps, also known as zoomies, after being tickled. So they like to be tickled, and just like with humans, rat laughter is contagious. So if one rat laughs, the other ones join in, and it's kind of an invitation to play. So rats that are deaf from birth cannot hear their friends making the play vocalization or laughing, so they tend to play significantly less. So then we can look at their behaviors as adults, these rats that didn't play as children, and they are often socially, emotionally, and cognitively impaired. They can't read their peers' social cues well, they are less likely to mate, they are more aggressive. So play sets up these really important social circuits in animals. So even if you don't play games as an adult, the play of childhood set up these important social circuits and probably defines a lot about your personality and how you interact with people. And I should also mention that this was all work originally looked into by the psychiatrist Jaak Panksepp, who was working in the 20th century when a lot of psychology was dominated by B.F. Skinner, the work of B.F. Skinner, who was into behaviorism. It was kind of this idea that you think of behavior as this kind of control of the animal, and you give it rewards and punishments to control the behavior. It was done in like artificial environments of mazes. And Panksepp was more interested in, well, what are natural behaviors that arise spontaneously, and what are their potential survival benefits? And I think part of the reason he was interested in this was after World War II, his family was interred in a refugee camp in Germany after the war was over. And he remembers being a child in these kind of depressing camps with his parents full of anxiety and being very depressed, and he and his friends playing on the shells of old tanks and things. So it kind of shows that there are different ways of looking at games, both as this kind of creative expression, this expression of joy, and as mechanisms of control. So we learned that play is this really crucial socializing force. And this was actually intuited thousands of years ago by Plato, who saw games as this important form of civic education. He reasoned that children learn to play games and they learn to follow rules. And as a result, as adults, they know how to follow laws. So this is, of course, a really important skill for a functioning democracy. But our ancestors didn't play games because they're educational. They played them because they're fun. So what is so absorbing about them, and why have they been with us so long? So we can remember that games were something that the brain created to fascinate itself. And what the brain likes to do is learn. So the brain's whole MO is to make models of the world, to be able to anticipate what's going to happen so it can kind of move in the world and be ready for whatever events occur. So when it doesn't have a model of the world, when something is uncertain or surprising to the brain, this is like a big red flag of like, there's something here I don't have a model of, I want to learn more about it. And games are all about uncertainty. They are, whether it's a game like dice when you're playing with the uncertainty of dice rolls, or if it's a game like chess when it's fully kind of determined by the strategy of the players, but you're still dealing with the uncertainty of how your partner will, what moves your partner will make. But this isn't just kind of philosophizing, and we can see that games are, uncertainty is even addictive from neural data, and I promise this will be the only data we really look at. But when we look at dopamine is an important neurotransmitter in the brain, an important chemical. And we hear a lot about it in the news, that it's often mischaracterized as a pleasure molecule. But what it really is a learning signal. And dopamine is actually what makes addictive drugs addictive, because addictive drugs will spike dopamine levels in the brain. It's a learning signal. You learn to continue that drug-seeking behavior that came before it. Wolfram Schultz is a neuroscientist whose lab did a series of canonical experiments looking at the dopamine neurons in monkeys. So they recorded from dopamine neurons and trained the animals to see a light cue and then press a lever to get a reward, like a juice reward. So when they recorded from these dopamine neurons in the brain, they saw that after the cue and the animals doing the behavior, the dopamine neurons increase their firing until the animal gets a reward. Now, what happens and this is the case if you give the reward 100% of the time, they always get the reward. What happens if you only give the reward half the time, so like 50% of the time randomly? The dopamine neurons go crazy. They fire really strongly to this uncertainty. And just to kind of hammer this home, if you give the reward with only 25 or 75% probability, you get this kind of intermediate response. So the difference here is that 25 and 75 are less uncertain than 50%. So the more uncertain the stimulus, the higher the dopamine response. And so this is what makes gambling addictive. And this is kind of the domain of social engineering in casinos. A lot of games in casinos are intentionally set at like a 50% reward rate to kind of addict players. And so there is such a thing as like people being addicted to gambling, and there are somewhere between 1% to 3% of the global population is addicted to gambling or problematic gamers. And these are problems because they can cost people billions of dollars annually, and it's actually the population with the highest suicide attempt rate. But this is also true in that sort of technologies, games on your phones are intentionally incorporating these elements to try to addict players. And this is not to demonize games or gambling, but to demonstrate what a hold they can have over us. And this is, again, not new. There is a 3,500-year-old Hindu scripture where they liken dice to a drug, an addictive drug, soma. So this being the case, our fascination with dice actually led us to some really powerful mathematics. So gambling was also huge in ancient Greece and Rome. And lots of Roman emperors were like major gamblers. But there's also a very interesting spiritual significance to dice in the ancient world. So in the Bible, there's a lot of stories of people using lots to divide inheritances or dice to decide military drafts. And so there's this kind of feeling that there's a quality of fairness to dice because it's random. And part of this was because people thought that the randomness of dice reflected the will of God, that they somehow linked the unknowability of chance to the unknowability of like what God wanted. And so these dice, or these 20-sided dice found in Egypt, and they have the names of gods on the side of them. So people would go to a priest and with a problem, and the priest would roll this dice and then tell the person which god they should pray to solve their problem. So there's this really interesting sort of both sacred and profane side of dice. And this blew my mind, but the Greek word for chance, kleros, gave rise to the word clergy, because not just anyone could interpret these dice throws. It had to be like the religious elite. So gambling continued to be really huge in the Renaissance, particularly in Venice, where they had a 6-month carnival season where people would wear masks and costumes and gamble and drink and have affairs and dance and generally act like the original anonymous internet trolls. So this is where the casino was born in 1638. And it was so popular that the aristocracy almost collapsed because they gambled so much they lost all their wealth. Spas were another place where gambling was really huge. People would go to, get healthy in a spa and then gamble while there. Louis XIV apparently encouraged his whole court to gamble because it kept them indebted and enthralled to him. So it was a huge pastime, and this made it such that there was a massive economic incentive for people to start working out, is there something we can understand here? Can we work out the math of chance? And given how long people have been playing games, it's actually kind of amazing it took us this long to get to probability theory. So this really took off when Blaise Pascal, who was a child prodigy, started thinking about this. By the age of 19, Pascal had invented a mechanical calculator. He had contributed to understanding of the physics of pressure. He was a really big deal. But when he was 19, his family converted to a religious sect called Jansenism, which forbade thinking about math because it was profane. So this brilliant person was not allowed to think about math for a while until he had this dissolute period for a couple years around when his dad died, where he did some world-changing math and then had another conversion and then lived the rest of his life not allowed to think about math. So during his dissolute period, he indulged in math and he indulged in gambling. And another gambler, a friend of his, put some questions to him that set him to thinking. One of these questions was, well, if I bet on this roll of dice, I tend to win money, but if I roll on this other roll of dice that I think is the same, I tend to lose money. Why is that? And another question he put to him was, if two people are playing a game of bala, which was a popular game at the time where the first person to win 6 points would win the game. So he said, well, okay, what if two people are playing and one person has 2 points and the other person has 3 points, but they have to stop playing the game because some external thing happens, the hall is on fire or whatever. How should they split the winning pot fairly? So there were not academic journals at the time. So Pascal wrote to a more established mathematician, Pierre de Fermat, to offer some answers to these questions. And together they came up with the foundations of probability theory. For example, they came up with a definition of probability, which is just the ratio of one outcome over all possible outcomes. And it turns out that dice were a really perfect realm to be thinking about this because it's such a clearly defined place to think about chance. So, if you ask what is the chance of rolling a 2, well, there's 6 sides to a die and there's 1, 2, so it's 1 out of 6. So it was a really kind of serendipitous realm to be thinking about these questions in. And then this question about how to split a winning pot of bala led them to the idea of expected value. So what is the average value you would expect from a particular event? And this ended up being really foundational for a lot of business and also for ideas like kind of mathematizing fairness. So this was huge. Chance, which was thought to reflect the whims of God, was actually something that could be systematized. It operated according to laws. You could project from past data to infer what will happen in the future. In the same way that Sir Isaac Newton made this amazing leap that the same gravity that works on heavenly bodies works on sort of prosaic objects here on Earth, Pascal and Fermat realized that chance is not just some secret in the mind of God, but something that we can measure and mathematically calculate. Today we can say something like, tomorrow there's a 40% chance of rain, which feels very mundane, but is actually totally revolutionary because it used to be that, this was up to the whims of God. It was fundamentally unknowable. So this was a huge win for the scientific method, which was very popular at the time and getting more popular. And so not only did we come up with laws of chance, probability theory became the language of science in many ways. It was this really perfect mathematical language for the empirical revolution, because it's a language that allows us to talk about things we don't know, to kind of give a number on our how well we know something. And so this was perfect for science, and it also had a huge impact on business. And you can still see this today when we talk about business being bets and ventures, and the stock market is a series of bets we make. So it's interesting to see, and I don't know that this is the best metaphor for business, because I wonder what a different world we would live in if instead of thinking about businesses as bets, they were like calculated social goods or collective efforts. But in any case, people started to realize that games were this amazing way for us to start to maybe understand the world and make choices in it, choices that are informed by data. So the drawback of this is that probability theory can make us think that we know more about what we don't know than we do know. By this, I mean the randomness of dice is a very orderly kind of randomness. It's of a very different nature than the randomness of events in the real world. In the real world, you're much more likely to get kind of big shocks, big unexpected events. And this sounds like a very theoretical problem, but it's actually very practical. So for example, one potential contributor to the ongoing kind of replication crisis in a number of sciences is that scientists are just using the wrong kind of chance to characterize their data. So they are kind of underestimating the randomness and using the wrong kinds of statistics to describe their data, and this would lead to results seeming like they're significant that are not. This also seemed to have contributed to the 2009 financial crisis, because bankers were using an incorrect model of risk to describe the volatility of the stock market, and so they were vastly underestimating the chances of these big systemic risks. So when one did happen, it sort of dominoed through the system, and a number of banks collapsed. Nevertheless, thinkers started taking games really seriously, given that we had this amazing, shocking success that we were able to find the laws of chance. The other founder of calculus, Gottfried Leibniz, self-funded a game academy in Berlin because he thought that games were this really perfect representation, like a miniature of the world. And he thought we could use games to kind of model and understand the world at large. And this was, again, another long-standing intuition. So if you look in the archaeological record, most children's toys, tend to be miniatures of things that adults play with. So kids play with miniature brooms, miniature guns, baby dolls, cash registers. Fred Rogers said that play is the important work of childhood. So the question is whether we can understand the world by playing at it. And one of the most surprising successes of this was in the realm of war. So this started in the 6th century India with chess, which was meant to be an abstraction of war. In that time, it was known as chaturanga, which any yoga practitioner will know means four-limbed. And it was meant to represent the four limbs of the Indian army. And these pieces from this older chaturanga board, chessboard, have now evolved into the modern European chess with the pawns and bishops and rooks and knights. And the vizier became the queen. But the idea was that this was supposed to be a kind of abstraction of war. And actually, in medieval times, the nobility and knights would play chess as a way to learn about strategic thinking. And also, it was thought to kind of act like a mirror to help people see themselves more clearly in it, see the way they think. By 1780, the German mathematician Johann Helwig wanted to teach military strategy to his students and find a tool to help him with that. So his idea was to kind of layer realism back into chess to make it more of a realistic simulation of war. So he expanded the chessboard to 1,600 squares and color-coded them to represent these different terrains, but the military never really adopted this because it was still very rigid and a little too abstract to teach people real military tactics. Over the next several decades, a father and son team, the von Reutzwitzes, set out to perfect the game because they saw the potential in it. By then, there were scaled maps of real battlefields that they could use to play the game on actual maps of real territories. And so you can see here by 1824, they had kind of perfected this game, and it was adopted by the German military and the German royalty. And by then, what was happening is they're playing on these scaled maps of real battlefields, and the German officers would be divided into two teams, one playing the role of the Germans and the other playing the role of some enemy force. And each turn of the game was meant to simulate 2 minutes of warfare. So they would have these little lead block troops they would push around, and they could decide if they were going to advance or attack or whatever they wanted to do. And then there was an umpire who was adjudicating the outcomes of their actions. And they couldn't see each other's positions to kind of simulate the fog of war. This was a really great way for these officers to get a bird's eye view of the battlefield, to think through new techniques, and also it helped bright young officers rise through the ranks on the strength of their ideas, because people could work together, they could understand how each other's minds worked, they could understand how a plan would really work in a high-level sense. And rather than relying on nepotism, we could sort of find the brightest officers to promote. It also became this incredibly accurate simulation engine. So thanks to advances in statistics and probability theory, the von Rietzweises were able to incorporate real actual data from battles into this data table that the umpires would consult. And so whenever one side would make an attack, they would consult, there was this kind of artillery and this many men were hurt, to get an idea of what the casualty would be, somewhat randomized by these dice throws to introduce a little bit of noise into the simulation. So this ended up being really powerful as a simulation engine, and the German military could predict when they would need reinforcements, when they would need to be resupplied, how many battalions they would lose, how many battalions they would destroy. So it was really our first supply chain technology. In the 1870s, King Wilhelm used Kriegsspiel to plan a series of battles that he used to cohere the first German empire. And these were stunning victories no one thought were possible. And he credited a lot of the success to Kriegsspiel. So this rocketed Kriegsspiel into international stardom. So this really blew my mind when I learned that a game directly shaped the face of modern Europe. And I think video games get a bad rap for causing violence, but here was a game that actually caused lots of deaths. But it gets even crazier. The fate of the world has hung in the balance of a game more than once, but I will tell you about this one time. So the Nazis had used Kriegsspiel in the early days of World War II to plan their early successes. So they successfully invaded France in 1940, which nobody, not even really the Germans, thought was possible. So this was amazing, and their next goal was to then invade Russia. The idea was they would exterminate the Russian population, and then their Aryan master race could expand into Russia. So Hitler had his top general, Franz Halder, plan the invasion of Russia using Kriegsspiel. So Halder worked it out to the end of 1941. He figured that the German troops would have invaded so many miles into Russia. He expected that they would have destroyed 240 Soviet battalions, and he estimated that this would mean that they would have about 60 left. And to his mind, this was basically victory. They would have basically destroyed the Soviet military. But little did they know that the Soviets had also used Kriegsspiel to plan for the invasion. Kriegsspiel, like I mentioned, was internationally famous, and they knew that Hitler had designs on Soviet territory. So they prepared for the invasion, and it turns out that this rising star of the Soviet military, General Zhukov, role-played as the Germans. And he role-played so brilliantly that Stalin was terrified of what was about to happen. So they ended up throwing all they had at the German invasion. So even though by the end of 1941, Halder's estimations were correct, they were almost exactly as far into Russia as they expected, they had destroyed 248, not just 240, of the Soviet divisions, but the Soviets still had 220 left, not 60, like Halder was expecting. So Kriegsspiel, sort of helped the Soviets staunch the German invasion. And I don't want to give away too much, so you'll have to read my book, but if you want to know how World War II ends. So the writer H.G. Wells was obsessed with Kriegspiel. He thought it was so fun. So he made it into a kind of home game called Little Wars that ended up evolving into games we know today, like Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons. So the empire of Kriegspiel became the Dungeon Master in Dungeons and Dragons. And then Kriegspiel, some form of Kriegspiel, of war games. I forgot to mention that Kriegspiel means war game in German. But Kriegspiel is more or less used by militaries all over the world today for planning and for training purposes. So whereas Kriegspiel was a way for military officers to kind of zoom out and model a particular battle, mathematicians would next find a way to zoom out on conflict itself and to model kind of human conflict. So game theory is a branch of mathematics founded in 1944 by the mathematician and physicist John von Neumann, who is regarded by many people as the smartest man who ever lived. He was a Hungarian Jew who fled Europe in the 1930s. He was understandably completely horrified about what was happening in Europe at that time, and really depressed. And as a result of this, he wanted to understand human behavior and what makes humans tick. Why do we make the choices we do? And what defines an actually rational, a truly rational choice? So he combined efforts with the economist Oscar Morgenstern to model human behavior as a game. Because you can think of, we're kind of moving in these games where I'm trying to get something, you're trying to get something, we're trying to make choices that will maximize our chance of winning this game. So we have to make choices like kind of taking into account the fact that somebody else is making choices, maybe trying to get the same thing we want. The model is ultimately game theory is ultimately predicated on the idea that the agents in this model are selfish. They're making choices to get what they want. It was intended as a model of human behavior, but I think it's important to note that ultimately it's just pure mathematics. What they're describing are optimization functions. They're functions trying to optimize some quantity. But this didn't stop people from using them as models of humans. We'll talk a little bit later about the fact that game theory is not a very good model of people's real behavior, but it's now been kind of adopted by economists. It's sort of the foundation of modern economics, and was also highly influential on military policy. So with World War II came the advent of nuclear weapons, which made people feel like our technological advances were vastly outstripping our traditional methods of diplomacy. Whereas war used to unfold over the course of months as troops moved over land by foot or by train, now with the advent of airplanes and missiles, the course of history could be changed in the matter of hours or minutes. So game theory was touted as this science of decision-making, that it would tell us how we could make decisions lightning fast to deal with the state of the world as it was. And this is another idea that has been around for a long time, that we can use games to kind of elevate war from base animal instinct to a level where the intellect can operate. This is a 3,000-year-old papyrus from Egypt depicting a gazelle playing a board game with its traditional enemy, the lion. So the idea is that, instead of getting caught in these base animal instincts, we would be able to wage war rationally. So then game theory informed doctrines like mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And this is the idea that two nuclear powers could maintain a kind of uneasy peace, because if one were to attack the other would send off so many nuclear bombs it would ultimately end the world in retaliation. Now, the question is, does this really make sense? Can you imagine a world where one country gets attacked and the other country, the president of another country decides to end the entire world because of that? It's kind of hard to believe. And This was actually something that Richard Nixon, the US president, tried to sort of adopt, the idea that it would take a madman to actually follow up that threat. And so he made a lot of choices to project the idea that he was a madman. And the Vietnam War was in part waged to underscore America's credibility to be so immoral that they would be willing to end the world if provoked. So unfortunately, we have this like model of rationality that is leading to these pretty irrational behaviors. The other idea that could help with a doctrine like MAD would be to have an automated system set off nuclear bombs if attacked. So this is the plot of the movie Dr. Strangelove, where the titular character is actually modeled on John von Neumann. So the idea in Dr. Strangelove is that the Russians had built this automated system that will automatically end the world if the Russians get attacked. But before they have a chance to announce this, a rogue American general attacks the Russians, and in so doing, ends the world. And of course, games and these automated type decision systems have a long history. The Americans and the Soviets never actually did succeed in making automated nuclear systems, but they definitely were working on it, and in some ways we still are. So and also in many ways, game theory was a predecessor in some ways to artificial intelligence because it was intended to be a kind of synthetic rationality. But the history of games and AI goes much farther back to at least 1819, when Charles Babbage, the inventor, played the Mechanical Turk. The Mechanical Turk was meant to be this automaton that played chess. Of course, it was really a man in a box moving like a puppet with, the spectators were playing chess against it. So Babbage played this, and he knew it was some kind of hoax, but he thought, boy, wouldn't it be cool if a machine really could do that? He eventually, worked on inventions with the idea of mechanizing intelligence. So he came up with the difference engine and then later the analytical engine, which are our first kind of proto-computers. And his mentee, Ada Lovelace, was the first programmer of his machines. Lovelace, when still a child, a student, she wondered if we could take games like solitaire and turn them into mathematical functions and solve them. And apparently she and Babbage had considered using sort of programming the analytical engine to play games as a way to maybe drum up attention and funding for the project because they were always running out of money. And they ended up not doing that, but that has since become the standard play for a lot of AI companies who train computers to play games in some ways for attention. Apparently, Lovelace also was a big gambler and lost thousands of pounds gambling on horses because she thought she had come up with a mathematical system for placing bets. But this really came into its own in the 1940s and 50s with the advent of digital computers, which were in some ways spearheaded by Claude Shannon and Alan Turing. Both of them in 1950 independently published papers where they proposed that we could use games like chess as the sort of domain for building up machine learning, for building up artificial intelligence. And they both independently wrote their first chess-playing algorithms using ideas from game theory. So they both conceived of games as being this kind of like branching tree of possibility. So, I could move these 3 pieces lawfully, and then you could move any of those pieces if I move those pieces, and so on and so forth. So you could kind of think through all of the, the tree of possibilities for the games, and then have a automated system work out the expected value of like which of these moves would most likely lead to a win. And so in this way, they conceived of mechanizing game playing and creating a computer program that could play a perfect game of chess. So this set researchers off on a quest to use games to bootstrap intelligence. And sometimes the focus was more on winning games than on really understanding intelligence. This led the AI researcher John McCarthy to complain that it's as if the geneticists after 1910 had organized fruit fly races and concentrated their efforts on breeding fruit flies that could win these races. So we maybe spent too much time focusing on games, but that's not to say that we didn't get anything out of it. So thanks to our work in games, computer scientists came up with some really foundational algorithms, like search algorithms, and we also learned a lot more about how the brain's dopamine system works. I'm not going to get into that, but I think this era is more or less over, right? AI companies have basically solved or have created programs that play these games at really high levels. So we've bested human champions in most games. But what they're now looking at doing is, in a way, gamifying reality. So when you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And if you have a program that works by optimizing your score or optimizing your chance at winning, you're going to try to turn things into games in order to make progress on them. And I would say that language models are an example of this. So language models like ChatGPT that people have probably played with or seen have this incredible, uncanny ability to emulate language. But the way they're trained is actually a gamification of language. So they're fed large corpus of text, and some of the words are kind of cut out, and the program has to learn to guess the words that are missing. And this trains the program to learn these complex webs of associations and learn the kind of statistics of language. But because it's turned language into this kind of circular game, they don't have a grounded understanding of reality, which is why these systems have so much trouble with making up facts. So we are making progress in AI, and we're still not at the point where we could let a system decide whether it should end the world because of a nuclear attack. We should probably get self-driving cars working first. But we do have automatic drones working, so that's something. So what does this mean? We've seen that games have been hugely influential in science and business and the military, and game design is now in a lot of our technologies, and game theory is influencing a lot of our technologies. It dictates how ads are served to us, how we are matched on dating apps, how we're paired with jobs on job sites. So could this be impacting our behaviors? This matters because the fact that we have, if we have a bad model of an atom, it doesn't hurt the atom or change anything about the atom. It just means we don't understand the atom. But if we have incorrect models of people that are in place in our technology and in our society, this can be harmful because people learn and they change and they adapt their behaviors. So to demonstrate this, we'll go back to game theory and talk. I mentioned earlier that it's a poor model of real human behaviors. And there's a famous paradox in game theory known as the prisoner's dilemma. So the prisoner's dilemma is a kind of thought experiment or a game where you imagine there are two criminals who committed a crime together, and they're jailed separately. And they have to decide, when they're talking to the policeman, whether they're going to cooperate with one another and stay silent about the crime, or betray one another and tell on the other person. And the catch is that the cost or benefit of cooperating or betraying will depend on what the other person does. So if they both cooperate and stay silent, that is the global optimum. They both only serve 1 year of jail. If one betrays the other, but the other stays silent and cooperates, the one who betrayed his friend goes off scot-free, and the one who cooperates, who kind of stayed silent, will be in jail for 5 years. If they both betray one another, they have to stay in jail for, let's say, 2 years. So the global optimum is for them to stay silent. But according to game theory, which again is predicated on the idea that the agents in game theory, supposedly the people, will make choices out of their own self-benefit, the game theory says that the prisoners should always betray one another because they should always be trying to get freedom. And so the kind of paradox here is that by choosing the thing they think will be best for them, they actually end up in the worst situation where they're both in jail for a long time. And the beauty is that most people don't actually do that. Most people, if you take them in a laboratory, like a lab experiment, a psych experiment, where you have them play this kind of game, this structure of game, most people natively, naively will cooperate with one another. But what's even more amazing is that it also depends on how you present the game to them. So if the psychologist running the game, running the experiment, tell the players in it, the participants, that it's called the Wall Street game, 70% of them will betray one another. If you tell them that it's called the community game, 70% of them will cooperate. And this is the exact same game, same rules, same everything, it's just the title. So we will change our behaviors depending on what game we think we're playing. So, if you think about Monopoly, you cannot win Monopoly unless you act like a cutthroat capitalist. You have to stab your family in the back. You have to act awful. Even if who you are as a person is like a gentle, kindly, lovely person. So games can induce us to act out of line with our real values. And of course, this doesn't matter in Monopoly when you can just walk away. But if games are sort of lining our world and making up the world we're moving in, we can't necessarily opt out of them. So, and this is particularly insidious with, when we know that some forms of gaming can be addictive, and there are companies consciously trying to addict us and enthrall us to their platforms. We're also seeing gamification come into the world in our everyday things. So for example, Amazon has an app for its warehouse workers that has gamified their work tasks. And it's been linked to a rise in workplace accidents because they're kind of nudged to work more and work faster than is safe. But I also don't want to give gamification too much credit, because the way it is today, the way it stands today, it's not actually that good. And to demonstrate this, I've imagined a gamified achievements page for Sisyphus, the legendary Greek king who was sentenced to an eternity of rolling a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down. So you can see he has a 50,000-year-old hot streak. He has multiple awards. But so these gamification elements can't actually make any task fun. It's not like they can magically control us. But it can control us in subtle ways, as we saw in the prisoner's dilemma experiments. And I should also say that it can also be used to control us in kind of positive ways, or to maybe nudge us in positive ways. We can use game theory to build systems that incentivize positive behaviors. For example, like being honest or cooperating. The board game designer Reiner Knizia says that when he designs a game, he first thinks about the scoring system and how the score will incentivize the players to play the game that he wants them to play. So that's how he gets people to, that's how he designs a game. If the game theorists have now sort of formalize this in a field known as mechanism design, or reverse game theory, where they can design systems that incentivize particular behaviors. And my favorite example of this is the organ donation market. So in the 1990s, organ transplants were technically feasible, but no one could really do them because most patients' immune systems would reject the organs that they were donated. In early 90s, a drug that suppressed the immune system was approved by the FDA, and basically overnight, organ transplants became technically feasible and a reality for hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. So there's suddenly this huge demand for organs and no organs to be had. So this is an example of like a technology opening up a new market, which happens all the time. But the question is, how do we design the market? So H. Berry Jacobs was a disgraced medical doctor who had recently gotten out of jail for prescription fraud. And he set up an organ brokerage where his idea was he would recruit poor people from across the world to donate their organs for money, and then rich people would pay the money for those organs, rich people who needed the organs, unless they wanted one for fun. But the rich people would pay for these organs, and then Jacobs would take a cut for a finder's fee. It's pretty common for businesses to move faster than government, but this idea was so repulsive to so many people that in 1994, the US Congress banned the sale of organs for money. So now we had a problem where all of our markets traditionally work with money. That's how we know how to match goods and services with the people who want them. So what do we do when we can't have a market that uses money? So these game theorists came up with a way of formalizing this. Now, money is not the only incentive in the world. Lots of people are willing to donate organs to their loved ones, like a kidney, for example, but they aren't necessarily a match for their loved ones. So there's all these willing people and willing donees, but not enough, not ways of kind of like matching them that money would traditionally play the role of. So, there was occasionally these serendipitous matches. There was an example of two women who were colleagues at work were talking in a bathroom one day, and they both realized that their husbands needed kidneys, but neither of them was a match for their own husband, and it turned out they were a match for each other's husbands, so they were able to have this like successful organ swap. But this was, it's very serendipitous. You can't really can't scale that. So these game theorists came up with a way using mechanism design, reverse game theory, to make a market where you could find these complex swaps of willing donors with people who needed the organs. So you're giving an organ to a stranger because you know that some other stranger will give an organ to your loved one. So this was an amazing success. It was, before this, an extremely inefficient process. And even though there's still a huge need for donated organs today, this was a major good thing. And so good that in 2012, Alvin Roth won the Nobel Prize for economics. And as a side note, H. Barry Jacobs in 2000 went to jail for strangling and murdering his wife. I hope I've convinced you that games have really potentiated human knowledge throughout history. And it makes sense if you think about it, because the brain invented games to fascinate itself. So maybe it's no surprise that by studying this thing that fascinates us, we learn more about how the brain works, about how chance works, theories of conflicts, and how to emulate intelligence. Games are a technology that can both be expressions of sort of spontaneous joy and also subtle mechanisms of control. So it's up to us to decide how they're used. Thank you so much for coming.